he's going to read our second Bible reading. We've heard about Jesus meeting Peter, and now we hear about Jesus meeting Paul on the road to Damascus.
Our reading is from Acts 9, verses 1 to 6. I'm reading the New International Version. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogue in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," he replied. "Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." This is the word of the Lord.
Christ is alive, no longer bound to distant years in Palestine, but saving, healing, here and now, and touching every place and time. Today we've heard how the risen Jesus touched the lives of Peter and those other fishermen and transformed them. Touched the lives of Paul as he went with those murderous threats to Damascus and changed his life for good. They're stories of transformation from failure, the failure of the disciples to catch anything. They're fishermen. They should be able to catch at least a fish, if not be good disciples, but they catch nothing that night. But Jesus directs them, and then this massive haul of fish. And of course we know that John is not just talking about fish in this story. He's talking about the mission of the church, of those disciples no longer catching fish, but catching people, not in some manipulative way, but drawing people into that loving embrace, touch of Jesus, of the living God. And Peter, so full of regret and guilt over his denial of Jesus in that temple courtyard, that night must haunt him when he said he knew nothing about this Jesus. He'd proclaimed his loyalty, that he would go to death for his Lord, and when the moment came, his courage failed, and he denied all knowledge of this Jesus. He must have shivered when he saw the charcoal fire that reminded him of that fire in that courtyard of the temple where he had denied his Lord. And there was Jesus taking him to one side. What did Peter expect at that moment? And gently Jesus asked him, "Do you love me? Do you love me more than these? More than yourself?" And Peter says, "You know I do love you." And then Jesus says, feed my lambs. And he does this 3 times that becomes increasingly painful for Peter, and yet healing. Christ is alive, no longer bound, but saving, healing here and now. There's a healing going on as Peter is confronted with what he has done, the failure at that moment when he turned from his Lord. But with the pain comes also healing, restoration, forgiveness, renewal, and purpose. He's given a purpose. Feed my lambs, care for my sheep. And of course, we've often thought of that as Peter being told to care for the church fellowship, for the Christian family, for the other disciples. Our pastoral images are often very cozy. We think of the flock of the church, of church members, of those who are in. But of course, when Jesus talked about sheep, he talked about lost sheep. He talked about sheep that had strayed. He talked about other flocks that they didn't know about. His talk of sheep was always those in need in the world, and not simply within the church. Those are the sheep that Peter is challenged to feed and to care for. And in time he discovers that those sheep even include people of other races, of other nations, not just his Jewish community, his people, but all people. And there's a wonderful point where Peter says, God has no favorites. God's love extends to Gentiles, to people of every nation, of every race. And that's where Peter is learning to feed and care for the sheep that Jesus has in mind. And then, dear Paul, or Saul as Acts describes him at this point in his life. Saul, who believes that he's doing God's work in destroying this little Christian movement, these troublemakers who are following the greatest of troublemakers to his mind, this Jesus who died the cursed death on a cross. And there is Saul on the way to Damascus that remains such a torn place today. He's there with murderous threats. He's there wanting to destroy. He's there wanting to imprison, to oppress, to persecute. All in the name of God. He believes he's serving God in this. And that's a challenge in itself. But he meets this Jesus who he had assumed had died on the cross and was dead and gone. And this Jesus simply says, "Why are you persecuting me? Why are you persecuting me?" And every insult, rift and war, in that great hymn we sang, where colour, scorn or wealth divide, Christ suffers still, yet loves them all, and lives where even hope has died. And Paul, or Saul, is transformed. And he too is given a new purpose. Go into the town, meet Ananias, this humble Christian. Learn more about this way and become my witness. And ultimately, Paul becomes one of the greatest missionaries and witnesses for Jesus. incredible transformation. And what about ourselves? Because these stories are not about some distant past, but they are about here and now. How Jesus touches our lives, saving and healing here and now, and touching every place and time. How will Christ meet us today? Dramatically, or gently, or mysteriously, or puzzingly? Maybe Jesus will meet us as we share that bread, as those disciples shared bread on the beach. And there he is beside you, challenging you to love him and to love his world. Maybe in that reading, as you heard Jesus saying to Peter, "Follow me," maybe that will be his word to you today. Or do you love me? That question. Maybe it will be in the conversations over tea or coffee after the service, or as you go out and see someone walking the street and wondering, have they known Jesus in their lives? Christ can meet us in so many ways. But one thing is sure, in this season of Easter, we are reminded that he is here and now, not bound to distant years in Palestine. And Love Wycombe becomes an opportunity for us to share that love with others. And we're all different personalities. And some of us will love to be part of a celebration out there in the town centre, and that will be our way of witnessing. Some of us may be quieter folk, and to pray quietly, walking round our street or neighbourhood will be the way for us. And yet others will want to do something practical, and maybe just picking up a bit of litter or doing a good turn for a neighbour will be our way. Whatever and however we express that love, may we do so. And may we know that we do so in the presence of Christ.